This genre isn't easy for me to comprehend. Greetings, my name is Nina, welcome back to my channel. So in this video, let's talk about sci-fi. So, sci-fi, such an interesting genre. All the spaceships, space battles, technological innovations, blasters, planets, you name it. Oh, and the extraterrestrials too. The visuals of the genre are beautiful and exciting. Sounds great, right? It's a genre that I should be 100% enjoying, right? Unfortunately, that's not the case here. I can definitely tell you that sci-fi is a genre that I really want to like. I really want to be enjoying sci-fi more because it's a really interesting genre. However, the books that I have encountered in recent years, they didn't give a positive impression. For a long time I couldn't understand why I couldn't get into more sci-fi. By all accounts, it should be my thing. It should be. Well, maybe I have read the wrong books. I doubt that many people heard of The Flickerman by Ted Kosmatka. I found the book absolutely randomly in a bookstore and I decided to give it a try. Not a bad book per se, but it's a one-time thing. It's something you read and then forget. Not something to be read again and again. Moreover, it had aspects that I didn't like. This book made me realize why it's hard for me to get into sci-fi, and here are the reasons. Well, the first thing is the protagonists. I noticed recently that a lot of sci-fi protagonists happen to be the same. More often than not, it's a scientist in their 30s or 40s. Not a bad thing per se, but they are overused. In most of the sci-fi that I have encountered, the protagonist is a boring scientist that only lives for work and has nothing outside work. No relatives, no friends, no hobbies, no hidden talents, no side projects, you name it, nothing. When they come home, there's always emptiness and sadness. They are absolutely isolated. Not even some interesting items to possess. And said protagonist, well, more often than not, it's a male character. Doesn't really... So this scientist has no life outside work. And this is incredibly dull and depressing, and it isn't something that I like to read. Yeah, fact about me, one aspect of books that I absolutely dislike is characters who only live for work and they have nothing else outside work. That their home life is absolutely non-existent, it's sad and everything. One of the reasons I like The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune, well, not sci-fi but fantasy, but still, is that while the main character mostly went to work and came home, at least at home he came to a positive environment. He had his records, his home was cozy, there was a cat, and he simply relaxed. He was living his best hobbit life, I'd say. But it isn't just about sci-fi or fantasy. I simply do not like stories about people who have nothing outside work. Okay, I digress, let's go back to sci-fi. Yes, I dislike such characters, both in sci-fi and beyond. And I know that a lot of stories, they tend to show characters improving their position, but I still do not like this. And the worst part, you would probably think that because, say, the scientist dedicates their life to work, they have achieved something there. Absolutely wrong. They're still nobodies there. Maybe they do something useful for a while, but they do not go far. At least in the beginning of the story, they are a nobody. Okay, I do understand that there's nothing wrong with the characters starting off this way. Nothing wrong with that. However, in sci-fi, such characters tend to be way too dull and depressing. I mean, way too much. Okay, maybe I'm judging the protagonist of sci-fi by the protagonist of The Flickerman. I do not even remember his name. I'm sure there are a lot of sci-fi novels, or not only novels, but also films and TV shows where the main character isn't the boring scientist with no personality or anything that makes life good, or doesn't go far at their job. One thing that I did not mention up until this point is that said boring scientists happen to be male. The reason I'm pointing this out now, because then we have female characters and they're even more predictable. This is absolutely terrible, and yeah. Well, in fairness, the protagonists themselves are boring and uninteresting, and the female characters, they match the energy. Why? Well, because, at least that was the case in The Flicker Man, but still, the very first female character that appears in such a sci-fi novel, once you see the female character in this book, well, there's this boring scientist and then there's a female character, it's a matter of time before they end up in bed. And they tend to end up in bed very soon. Excuse me, but that's not something interesting to read. They just look at each other, they say a few words, and a chapter later they're already in bed. What's so interesting? There's no actual foundation for their relationship. Yeah, there's no foundation here. The two bland, boring characters met and they ended up in bed, and that's kinda all. They also sometimes they go somewhere together and they are still bland and boring. It's a symbol of not so great writing to me. To be completely fair, I'm not exactly against their relationship per se. I'm against of it being incredibly boring with no foundation. I do not really like to read about really boring and dull characters who simply are kinda there together, and yeah, this isn't very interesting to read. Another thing that makes sci-fi difficult for me to read, well, I know that this point is kinda controversial to say because this is the foundation of sci-fi, but still, the technological part. By the way, I forgot to mention that even though I started this video by talking about sci-fi books, I'm going to mention movies too, and maybe TV shows if I can think of them. Anyway, let's go back to the technological part. I know that sci-fi is about technological innovation in the first place, I get that. However, some sci-fi stories, they get too technical, they get invested into technology way too much, and it's also about explaining technology, explaining, and it's really difficult to understand. I'd say pronouncing the names of characters and the places in fantasy stories are easier to understand than this. I really liked The Martian by Andy Weir. It had a really good story, good characters, and too much technology, too difficult to comprehend. I prefer a different type of sci-fi. I really like sci-fi like Dune or Star Wars or Ender's Game, where the technological innovation is already there and it's simply the basis, it's simply a playground for the characters. Yeah, in these stories, technology is already there and it's not the main focus of the story. In other words, I prefer technological innovations, like spaceships and everything is simply a set. And I want to see people using the technological innovation, not explaining it. And you know what? A Black Mirror TV show does this very well. Black Mirror isn't about technological innovation per se. Black Mirror is about how people use technological innovation. Yeah, in short, I like sci-fi where people use technological innovation, and I want to see how technological innovation changes people's lives. This is much more interesting than hearing people explain how technology works. Okay, let's go back to the protagonist, and there is another aspect of sci-fi I'm not necessarily fond of. Yeah, this is going to be a bit controversial again, but I'm going to say this. Another aspect of sci-fi I do not really like is the profession of the protagonists. Have you noticed that there are only two acceptable professions for a sci-fi protagonist? So I have mentioned scientists, and the second acceptable profession for a sci-fi main character is military personnel. Why aren't other professions allowed? Why can't the main character of the story be a teacher, a librarian, a CEO of a company, or even a rock star, a writer, or a blogger. Okay, I do understand why the protagonists tended to be scientists or military personnel originally. I do understand how they came to be in sci-fi. What I don't understand is why aren't other professions allowed? Why aren't people of other professions in sci-fi allowed to be heroes? You could come up with so many interesting stories around them. Even if you have the novel set in somewhere like Caladan or even Arrakis or something like that. The society doesn't only have the warriors and scientists or even politicians, but such societies tend to have teachers, even writers, because culture is still important, and you could write proper sci-fi stories surrounding such characters. Would be cooler to read about rock stars and their fans in sci-fi. Yes, have you noticed this pattern? For a long time you could read in sci-fi about scientists or military personnel. Allow other professions in sci-fi, please. Because interesting sci-fi stories can happen to them too. These people that I mentioned, the librarian, the rock star, you name it, they're still regular citizens, and scientists and military personnel are not. They have more access to things, but this doesn't mean that regular citizens can't have interesting stories surrounding them. But regardless of a profession, every single character I pointed out here is an adult. And what about the children? Unpopular opinion here, but I do think that sci-fi works better when the main characters are children. I really love E.T. the Extraterrestrial and Ender's Game. The main characters in these works are children, and it worked. Or the main characters could have been adults who kept their connection to their childhood, or they tried to regain it. You could have an adult that has had something happen to them in the past, maybe they witnessed something or something like that, and the story could be how this affects them as an adult or something. And also, I do really want to point out one interesting fact. And also, bonus point, I really want to talk about how sci-fi is perceived depending on the language you speak. So, in the Russian language, sci-fi is научная фантастика, science fantastics. Oh, wait a minute. Allow me to translate fantastica. So, in Russian language, sci-fi is actually научная фантастика. According to Google Translate, this is scientific fantasy. And this is why a lot of people who speak Russian, they confuse fantasy and sci-fi. So in English language, it's simply science fiction, fiction based on science, and fantasy is a completely different thing. But for the Russian readers, it's often the same. And we all know it's not. Yeah, that's simply an interesting fact to point out. And I do think that language affects the perception of the genres, and people compare fantasy and sci-fi a lot. Alright, that's all I wanted to talk about. I like sci-fi where technological innovation is there, or at least it's discovered at the beginning, and I would like to read how this changes everyday lives, how this affects everybody. I like this, and I like to see how people use the technological innovation. I do not need too much explanation. And also one important thing, some technological innovations that were considered wow back in the day, they did not necessarily age well. Alright, that's all. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you aren't too mad at me. And what do you think about sci-fi? Let me know down in the comments. See you next time. Goodbye.